Hello, everyone. Welcome to Collaborative Edges. Today, we continue our conversations on the notion of passing, identity, and self-representation across diverse languages and cultures. And to do this, we have invited to the studio Michigan State University professors Catherine Ryu, Japanese and Korean Studies, and Kirsten Fermaglich, History and Jewish Studies. Hello, Catherine and Kirsten. Welcome to our studio today.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. In December 2018, apropos passing in Russian cinema, we talked in another podcast about Zainichi Koreans who would like to pass as Japanese. At the time, Catherine Ryu shared her understanding of passing as, quote, an authorized movement between and through different identity categories that are not assigned to you, end of quote. To think and talk about passing in academic projects and in the classroom, Professor Ryu organized and led a faculty learning community in fall of 2018 and spring of 2019. Let's start with some questions about this community. Catherine, what conversations about passing have been taking place these months, and especially since our last podcast on Russian cinema last December?
Well, we had lots of exciting events happening since we last had this meeting. So last February 22nd, 2019, we had a special guest, Ms. Claudia Barrios Campos, and she's a PhD candidate in Hispanic Cultural Studies in the Department of Romance and Classical Studies here at MSU. And she presented her research on the figure of trickster as a form of passing. And in particular, she talked about the concept of trickster in one of the stories, including the Huarochiri manuscript.
That's good.
And Claudia's argument is that the representations of tricksters and their act of passing can be actually seen as strategic negotiation and resistance to regain some power, for example, social and religious power, and it guaranteed the survival of the indigenous storytelling in the Andean colonial world. So this particular session was really fascinating to me because she talked about passing not across national borders, but between people and living things, and even inanimate things such as like rocks. And so it was interesting to see the passing happening within the text, and then passing happening surrounding this manuscript in the context of the colonized world. Yeah.
Yes, that's something that happens in Andean culture and also across Latin America after the conquest.
Yeah. So this was actually presented as a formal meeting. So we had a discussion. It was you, Rosie,
Yes.
and then we also had a moderator, Daniel Mendez, from your department. And then in March 19th, 2019, we had a book discussion. So for this meeting, we invited Dr. Carrie Wallach. I hope I'm pronouncing her last name okay. She is the author of Passing Illusions. And so she led our group to think about the constructions and then controversial aspects of German Jewish identity, particularly in the context of Weimar Germany. So I'm sure Kirsten will have more to say about this particular topic, but she talked about not just on passing, but visibility of Jewish identity and the kind of complex negotiations that takes place in terms of how and when and why conceal Jewish identities. So that was very fascinating. And then in March was a very busy month for us. We had a global studies in the arts and humanities symposium. So for this, we invited Dr. Jennifer Robertson from the University of Michigan. And so in her talk, she didn't talk about passing per se, but she helped us to think about identity formation through our relationship to technology and the result of it, which is robots. So she talked about how we think of technology as something that's more progressive, but actually when you look at the robot industry, a lot of robots embody more conventional gender attributes. And she explained that as an expression of how male scientists, they are in particular cultural space in which they do not have to question the kind of privileges that they themselves have received. So even though we have this cutting-edge technology, but then gender ideology returns.
Yeah, the social constructions of gender ideology remain. They are so prevalent, and they are like normalized. It's part of
So that was very fascinating. And so then in conjunction with this public lecture, we also had a roundtable. So the roundtable focused specifically on pedagogical approaches to sexual minorities in curriculum development. And for this event, we had 5 speakers, including Jennifer Robertson, who represent different fields. And each presenter talked about how they incorporate sexual minorities as part of their in-class activities or course design. And that was really interesting and important conversation. We also had representative from LGBTQ Resource Center helping us to walk through the Q&A portion. And so I'm hoping that we can have more of this kind of discussion next year. And just to add one more, so it's because this Android talk was so interesting, we also had a little pop-up art exhibit. It's in Wells Hall.
Oh, cool.
And so what we tried to do was transform at least the appearance of hyper sexuality of robots' body, especially androids are very sexualized. So we dressed, we covered her up, we gave more mobility. So we, at least conceptually, can express that there are different ways of imagining androids.
Yes, I have seen that exhibit in the 3rd floor in Wells Hall. For how long is it going to be there?
We think we'll be there for about, until the end of April. But since a lot of people seem to like it, we may just have it there for a long time.
I think it should stay for a long time.
That's it.
Yes.
Permanent.
Okay, Kirsten, you are a historian and a specialist in Jewish studies. So could you tell us briefly about your ideas, projects, and contribution to the discussion of passing?
Sure, yes. So my main contribution is the book that I just wrote.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's been
Could you read the title?
12 years in the making, sure.
Wow.
It's called A Rosenberg by Any Other Name, A History of Jewish Name Changing in America. And so I looked at over 100 years of name change petitions in New York City Civil Court and was able to trace what I see as kind of the rise and the politics and the fall of Jewish name changing. Jews are, even though I didn't go in expecting this, Jews actually disproportionately changed their names in really, really high numbers, especially in the middle of the 20th century. And so I talk about the rise of this. It's a response to anti-Semitism. I also talk about the politics of it, and that's really where passing comes in the most because there's a real debate within the Jewish community in pretty much the 1940s, 1950s that sees Jews as passing when they change their names. It sort of sees them as moving into a different category, kind of abandoning the Jewish community and trying to become non-Jewish, right? Sort of trying to pass within a non-Jewish community. And my chapter actually sort of explores the possibility. I think what I found mostly in my evidence is that that's not the case, that people were not, for the most part, some people were indeed trying to escape the Jewish community and, converting or sort of really separating themselves from the Jewish community. But I think a lot more often what I see is that people see names as something that can be put on to use as Jews are beginning to become more successful in white middle-class settings. They're able to get jobs which they weren't able to get before the war. Having changed names allows them to sort of have new opportunities, and as they do so, their names are constant reminders. I mean, this is always the case when they change names. It's kind of like walking into a room and saying, "Hi, I'm Jewish," right? Which they don't choose to do. And this is in part it's because there are sort of Jewish names. That this is about sort of the history of Jewish names, but their names kind of identify them and precede them. And they don't necessarily want that. They want sort of the flexibility and the power to be able to be Jewish when they want to, and to be able to travel in white circles. And, a lot of whiteness is kind of the privilege to be invisible if you want to, right? To be able to sort of, invisible. I'm making scare quotes there, which you can't see on the podcast, but, to sort of walk through a middle class world and not have your identity questioned, not have your origins questioned, not have your race identified. And so my argument is that most of the people that I see in the petitions, also in correspondence that I found at the time, also in even published materials that people have used before as evidence to say, oh, lots of Jews are moving out of the Jewish community. If you really read those published materials closely, they're not. They're actually still really engaged in the Jewish community. They're still members of religious communities. They still live in Jewish neighborhoods. And they're also changing their names as families, almost always. Not almost always, but large numbers of them are changing with mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, children. And so it's much more complicated than just sort of imagining that people are sort of crossing. So I use, and Carrie Wallach does too, and we could bring in Carrie Wallach. That's how Carrie and I actually met, is she and I both use the work of both Irving Goffman and also Kenji Yoshino, who is at Yale, who talks about covering. So Yoshino borrows Goffman's work on covering to sort of think about this as a larger spectrum of activity that goes back and forth across boundaries. Goffman uses the term covering in a very veiled allusion to Jews. And so what I do in my work is sort of suggest that that's much more what's happening, that people are not fully moving over into another border, but that they are sort of they are using it flexibly when they need to, so that they don't announce themselves so openly.
Yes, what a fascinating topic. I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
First, when you say the change, what kind of change is it? Is it phonetic, spelling, translation?
No, actually, strikingly, and that happens with other groups that they do more translations. There's very few translations. What they are doing much more is lopping off. So like the title is a Rosenberg by any other name, but they might call themselves Rose. So Rose would be a very classic Jewish name, actually. Or Burke, if you see the name Berke or Berk, that's frequently a Berkowitz. And so I have a few others, but then they also have names where they've chosen a name that is, I don't like to call it anglicized, because a lot of these names, because you might also, like the name Moses, for example, they might take a name that has actually a Jewish meaning and is actually an anglicized name, right, is a name that actually works in English as itself an anglicized Hebrew name, and make it into Mark, right? So they are getting rid of kind of the markers of ethnicity. Sometimes in names that are perfectly pronounceable, like Epstein is a very pronounceable name, right? Even though they might say in their petition, I want it to be able to pronounce better, but they might call themselves Edwards. They're choosing names that are not noticeable. I think the best way, I call them anodyne.
And
they are looking for names that people won't.
That works with
exactly.
the passing. How interesting. I'm asking you this because in the case of Latin America, with the indigenous populations that were conquered and colonized, the languages, the indigenous languages spoken in what becomes Latin America are completely different from the Romance languages, from Spanish and the Romance languages of Europeans. So what they usually did, Kirsten, was translation. So for instance, the other thing is that the indigenous languages were oral in the sense that they didn't have written alphabetic script, although they did have the equivalent of written expression in many other forms that were not understood by the Europeans at the beginning. But what they do, therefore, is that, and I give you my own example. Quispe, my first last name, is a Quechua word that means shining. So it was actually pronounced more or less Jespi. And what happens is that the Spaniards hear it is perhaps something like what happened in Ellis Island. What I hear, I write, when it comes to the name. So the name becomes Quispe, the one you all know. And then it's a marker. It's a marker of race and ethnicity and discrimination because it's an indigenous last name, etc. But on top of that, and this is one of the good things that my specialization in colonial history has helped. I noticed, I was able to gather from the documents I have worked with that many Quispes or Jespis translated their names to espejo, which means mirror.
Oh, for shining.
And there is many people with that last name.
Interesting.
And then I didn't know until I found the explanation. And that's why I was asking you that question about that translation. They prefer to make translations.
Yeah, so I want to say
case.
2 things about that.
Yeah.
So the first thing is that it doesn't happen at Ellis Island. So that's
Yes.
actually one of the points of my work, even though it's not my argument per se, but most historians and genealogists and anybody who studies this, it doesn't happen at Ellis Island. Name changing doesn't happen at Ellis Island.
Yeah, but phonetic spelling changes?
No. So most people, Ellis Island, if you look at pictures, they actually have ship manifests.
Yes.
So any changes that are taking place with people's ticket buying that happens on the other side of the world, right? So it's not happening. It's not an official U.S. position. It might be much more about the documents that you are using in your native country or when you get to Germany, wherever your boat is leaving. Okay. It's going to happen. It might have happened at some point during that period, or it might be kind of a mythology that has actually grown up. And
it's
one chapter of my book is part of the mythology.
I think it's part of the urban legend.
Yeah, exactly. And one chapter of my book talks about that emerging.
And the cinema and the media.
Yes, exactly. Right. A lot of it post-1965, after Ellis Island is kind of begins to become, it had been left in disrepair and abandoned for years. And so it's actually after it becomes reimagined as a national park that people begin to see that as the place where their names were changed. But it doesn't actually exist much more before then in people's imaginations. But that was just a small thing that I just wanted to say. But I do think, so it is true that, so Jews, part of when you say a racial marker, I'm curious about how that works. So Jews, their names become racial markers because they get their last names belatedly. And they do become racial markers because only Jews are getting their names. Within Europe, they are getting their names much later than the rest of the population. And so when you say that Hispan, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, I'm sorry. What is it about it that it's a racial marker? Is it the QU? Is it the word?
Quispe has other last names like Guaman. People in the Andean countries immediately know that's a name of indigenous origin.
What is it word. So it's just the word. So it's not the word. Things about it.
Yeah,
it's that actual word.
And what I can tell you has happened to me is that people Peruvians telling me in Peru or outside of Peru, your last name is Quispe, but you look white. What happened there? So that is a very a strong statement. But I have had other experiences where that last name comes up, and then even more so the contracts with the other last name annually, who is from my mother, because my mother was daughter of Italian immigrants. So annually is Italian. So the combination doesn't click on top of everything.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it was, and then of course we have a different understanding of race and racism in Latin America because it's very social and. It corresponds to skin color and phenotype, but it's different the way it works here in the United States. I mean.
Well, and what I was going to say is that for Jews, they're getting their names in Europe, and there they are very much the outsiders, and it's not based on skin color at all. And actually, the name is actually frequently what is the marker. Did you look like you were going to say something, Catherine? You're looking, raising your hand.
So I'm just wondering, for those Jewish population that changed their names, did they ever reclaim back? Because that happens a lot with Koreans in Japan.
Yeah, very rarely.
Oh, very rarely.
Very rarely, yeah. So
they don't go back to now.
No,
the
very
new
rarely.
generations. Okay.
I won't say no at all. That my final epilogue talks about a family that chooses to, and there's a few other examples of people who have chosen to, but I found none in my petitions. I found a few Italians actually because other groups change their names too. It's just that Jews are doing it disproportionately, but very few. So what Jews do to sort of reclaim now that ethnic identity is a more comfortable thing, and anti-Semitism is less popular and doesn't prevent you from getting jobs and things like that in the same way, people use first names. So whereas they might have chosen a first name that would have been a name that was very explicitly trying not to be a Jewish name, now you see Jews much more choosing, say, a Hebrew name or a name that sort of feels like an immigrant name, like Max or or Sam, names that their immigrant grandparents might have had. So in that sense, they do that, but nobody brings back the old names.
Wow.
But not nobody, but many fewer, many fewer. Yeah.
I'd like to go now to the difficulties of teaching about this, and that's my next question for both of you. So, Catherine, how do you think this learning community has expanded or opened new possibilities for our pedagogical approaches beyond research? Passing, I'll ask the same question to Kirsten, and how difficult is this? Because I'm thinking about what our conversation, and I think in the difficulties of bringing this in the classroom.
So my experience of actually dealing with, for example, sexual minorities in my course, it only happened like last year. And I wanted to add Zainichi module, and I also wanted to talk about sexual minorities. So it all depends how you design the course. And I didn't want people to think that, Koreans in Japan are weird, or people with different sexual orientations are different from us. So I started with something much broader, which is like a national identity. So we studied Japanese formation of national identity in response to the West in the turn of the century, like 19th, 20th century, so that there they can already see that when Japan encountered the West, Japan became, very emasculated, and they took on the feminine side of the equation. And so that we already learned that power structure is actually expressed through the gendered relations, and that then we saw that in the context of Zainichi, the post-colonial period, that Japanese themselves then treated outsiders like Koreans exactly in the same way. So it's not necessarily that Japanese people abuse minorities or outsiders, but this is how the power dynamic works. So it's not blaming one particular group or one particular nation, but we have to look at how the system of power works, because there's always someone with more power, someone with less power. So after we have contextualized identity formation within the power structure, then we move through Zainichi module and then sexual minorities. So by the time we get to the final module, we had a better sense of all the different forces that shape one's sense of identity, collective identity as well as individual identities. So, but I also want everybody to have some understanding of how to talk about difficult topics such as sexual minorities. So we all took tutorial that's offered by LBGQT Resource Center, and that enabled us to have the same set of vocabulary, and that helped us to have a conversation. And I used anime, and this anime actually portrays very young students from elementary school to junior high school, and that's a transitional period, and these characters suffer deeply, and my students were really able to empathize with them and see for themselves that these children are so young, and these struggles are really real. It's not like they're performing, because they don't. Children don't know yet why they have this gap between what they look like and how they feel about themselves. So that was very moving experience for me as a teacher to see how my students responded. And also I knew that while we are discussing these transgender issues, there are a lot of students, maybe not a lot, but some students are dealing with this these kind of issues as their personal issues. So I just wanted to create an environment in which we can approach this with respect, sense of respect and openness. And I don't know how successful it was, but in terms of everyday conversation that grew out of this module was very thoughtful, and I think we just need to do more of this.
And I need to continue on that. Kirsten, have you had opportunity, I assume, to teach about this topic or at any level?
So my own topic?
Yes.
So it's interesting. I did assign my students an article of mine last year, and it's interesting that for me, I want students to see it more nuanced. I don't think I introduced it within the context of anti-Semitism. I learned a great deal from the seminar that Catherine organized on pedagogy, and really the conversation about sort of bringing it in with intentionality. I brought in my work on name changing to talk about anti-Semitism. And I have a large unit on anti-Semitism. But it was interesting to me that when students wrote their papers, the nuance that I had hoped that they would get, was not there. Like people were not as sympathetic to people changing their names as I feel like I am in my own written work. And I feel like incorporating them within a discussion of anti-Semitism offers the context for understanding why people are making the decisions. But still in students' papers, there was a lot of judgment, which is really, in some ways, really what I wanted to write against. So thinking about some of the stuff that you talked about makes me think about how it did make me think it's not so good to introduce your own work because, of course, you feel more. you
have to defend your work
too. You have to defend your stuff.
Yes, you expose yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And you think, why didn't you understand what I was trying to say? So I think if I were to organize, I still talk about my material in lecture, but I don't. I haven't asked them to read it because I was so struck by how many people were critical of the people that I was trying to be sympathetic about. I think if I were going to bring it in again, which I'd like to, I think I would try to do something more like what you did in a much more, as you say, intentional way to really sort of think through options and choices. I think that was I really liked. I liked that you had people do the tutorial. I mean, I thought a lot of that, and especially the way we talked about sort of intentionality in that discussion, the ways, having people see a larger a format and a structure. And I was actually thinking, at the conversation, I had brought up that in talking about sexual minorities, I had tried to teach about Jewish lesbians in a much earlier time, like when I first started teaching here in 2001, 2002, and I received a ton of resistance from students. They were very uncomfortable. They didn't want to talk about it. At the time. And so I think some of this has changed over time. I've introduced a segment on gay and lesbian rights since then, and it's been much more successful. But I think part of that is the change in time, right? Yeah. Our world has changed. Their world has changed. But I also think that it was the lack of intentionality. I do much more what you do in sort of building out an entire semester that is about difference, right? That sort of talks about difference within the Jewish community and different ways that difference is treated. And I think that incorporating gays and lesbians within that model permits for more considered conversation about it than I think it was when I first brought it up.
Yeah. And I actually have some thoughts about using the category like sexual minorities or diaspora or ethnic minorities, because if we maintain that, there's always this minority versus the mainstream. And so when we talk about passing only in relation to these marginalized groups, then we kind of reinforce that division again. So I was thinking about maybe using something like border, right? Then it kind of flattens out the playing field, right? So it's not just that only certain people have to pass, but we all always we work, across in between particular categories. And so then I can discuss, for example, the so-called mainstream author and Zainichi author in the same on the same page, right? That one is not privileged as the mainstream, one is not minority, but we just look at how they deal with border issues.
Yeah. Okay, we have to. I'm watching the time also because Catherine has another commitment. So, Catherine, I would like to talk briefly. What is happening next with this learning community, faculty learning community on passing, and what are the plans for next year?
Yeah, so I'm happy to report that we're going to continue on the same theme of identity formation and passing in global context. So we will have the same kinds of events. So we will have public lectures, and we'll have external speakers, and this time we'll have internal speakers. So I'll be reaching out to you.
Sure.
so that and ultimately I like to have a body of internal speakers who can then later put together an edited volume, maybe in 1 or 2 years.
I really
down the
want
road.
to read.
Yeah,
Thank you.
And learn more about your topic.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
fast, and it will resonate beyond
I hope
the
so.
Jewish
Yeah.
community.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope
Beyond.
so.
Yeah.
And it does. I do talk. The last chapter
Yes.
is actually all about non-Jews, actually, because I bring it up to a contemporary. So I'm glad. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Yeah, and then we will also have external speakers, and we are still in the process of finalizing who will be coming to join us. But I know for one speaker, and she will be talking about lesbian-themed literature in Japan, and in Japanese culture, lily, it's in Japanese is yuri. Yuri is a symbol of lesbian, so it's gonna be so next year. Next year will be the 100th anniversary of yuri literature. So we'll have a speaker who will come and talk about that particular topic, and then she will also lead a workshop. And the workshop will be on Japanese anime that deals with transgender identities. So how do you translate that into English when in the original the subject is not explicitly stated? And then we'll also have probably another 1 or 2 roundtable topics dealing with challenging topics. And then what else? I think that's quite a bit for now. And then next year it will be Professor Mark Bernstein, who is our colleague, and he's a scholar of Judaic and Islamic civilization. And so under his leadership, we will have another successful year of learning community, I hope.
When do activities resume again? In September?
Yes,
you
so
think?
it's a whole entire
Yes,
academic year.
yes.
So each month there will be at least one event of some sort.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you very much for being here today. I would like to conclude. I don't want to, but I have to conclude this conversation, thanking our guests today, Catherine and Kirsten, and invite you all to attend the new activities and presentations and roundtable on passing the next academic year, starting in September 2019. Thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for having us. It was great.
And last but not least, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Letters, any of our sponsors, or any official entities of Michigan State University. I also want to thank our technical producers, Nadav and Danielle. Tune in for our next podcast. Thank you very much and have a great end of the semester.